at the moment, there are very smart people saying there's a new future just over a very near horizon. And if we don't steel ourselves to explore that, and someone else does, then 70, 80 years of dominance in the air environment can be lost in a matter of weeks.
This is Battlelines, the Telegraph's foreign policy and defence podcast. I'm Roland Oliphant. It is Friday, the 18th of July, 2025. This week, Donald Trump finally promised to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine, a couple of days after saying he wouldn't send any more Patriots to Ukraine. It is a big moment, but just what is a Patriot missile? Why are they so important? Where did they come from? And is their military utility outweighed by their political and symbolic value? To answer these questions, we've brought in someone who has flown against anti-aircraft missiles and survived. Ed Stringer spent 39 years in the Royal Air Force, flying combat missions over Iraq and rising to the rank of Air Marshal. Ed, welcome to Battlelines. Let's start before we get into all the fun stuff that I'm going to ask you about, kind of zooming around the sky in a jet fighter. Let's start with the news. Donald Trump has said that he is going to send, or NATO is going to buy Patriot missile systems, and these are going to be delivered to Ukraine. Let's start with the Patriot before we get to the news itself. Tell us about the Patriot. Where's it come from? Why is it so special? Why does it have this huge cachet when we talk about it?
Older listeners might remember, Cold War era grainy footage around the inner German border and the supposed battleground of Europe, where missiles were out in the open, were pointy things that looked like they come off the Thunderbirds or Jetsons, and the radars associated them with big metal discs being mechanically scanned by large electric motors, and they're all analog, so huge power outputs and bleeps and squeaks of radars and whatever going off. And then suddenly in comes this very sleek thing in containers, looking like 4 very large cigar tubes, and a completely flat radar that just sat there, unmoving, and electronically scanned arrays, and something that supposedly could even shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. Not just the aircraft, which is what originally the Patriot was designed to defend against incoming attacking aircraft. And so I think there was a sense that, my God, the Americans have made a step change here. Everyone else now is left in the analog 1960s, and here is this incredibly sophisticated thing, and frankly, you shouldn't go up against it, because if it flies, it dies. That's 40 odd years ago. The Patriot's still there, and it's still being developed, and the missile now is much more capable, and the radars are much more capable. But later variations of air defense missile are all iterations, if you like, of the Patriot model. I'm sure we'll get on to talk about, do the Europeans have something equivalent? Well, yes, they do. And we can look at that, the Aster missile. But interestingly, you saw the Soviet Union, then Russian Federation, come in and copying it. So the S-300, S-400 Russian system look a little bit like Patriots. They're large cigar canisters on the back of trucks. They have those very modern, sophisticated-looking radars that don't spin round and are flat plate, electronically scanned. And once again, they have this fearsome reputation that if it flies, it dies. And that's why other nations have been very keen to get hold of them. So a step change in air defence, and something that still has a bit of an aura about it,
despite how long it's been there. So just so we can visualize it, a Patriot battery. Tell me if I've got this wrong. You got a truck with, as you say, 4 kind of cigar tubes or metal canisters that contain the missiles. Then you've got a separate truck with a radar on it, and you have another truck with a command module or something. Is that what it looks like?
So yes, you do. You have a battery of, there'll be external radars creating the picture, perhaps across a recognised air picture, it's called, perhaps across the whole theatre. Then more locally, you will have the radars of the Patriot battery that contribute to that, but take from it. All that is fused in a command and control system that makes sense of the picture. Targets will be handed to the Patriot battery. The Patriot battery will work out in which sequence to take the targets, and then the various launchers will be sequenced, and they will fly off under guidance to affect an intercept with the incoming threat, whether that's an aircraft as was originally designed, or, as everybody is worried about today, an incoming ballistic or hypersonic missile.
What do you make of this news? So Donald Trump, first the Americans were saying we're not going to send any more Patriots. Now he's saying we're going to send a lot. I have just read a piece on Reuters just before coming on, which says actually Donald Trump said NATO will pay and we will sell it to them. And now it turns out that there's still a debate amongst European NATO members about who is actually going to donate their Patriots to Ukraine and then order more from the Americans. So I'm not sure how quickly this is actually going to happen. But what's your what do you make of that news and that decision by Donald Trump? Is it good news for the Ukrainians as we've been led to believe? Should the Russians be worried?
I think it's good in the signalling that suggests that Trump might be serious about turning up the ratchet of pressure on Putin and saying, I'm happy to reverse some of these decisions. But it might have brought out that slight schism within the political wing of NATO that I've just alluded to, if the major NATO powers turn around and say, well, yeah, thanks for that, but we'll be doing it our way because we've got our own interests, we've got our own defences, we've got our own defence industries to worry about. And if we are going to supply air defences to Ukraine and we're going to pay for it, then we're going to pay for it by investing in our own industries to produce the air defence. Given the rate of production of Patriots and European systems, the Patriot is better than the European equivalents in that regard, but it's still lacking in what would be required in any wartime scenario, and that's before we figure in that the Americans are most worried, that all the wartime scenario they're most worried about, I should say, is that in the Far East and involving China. And if you look at the production of hundreds per year, even though the Americans claim they're ramping up, and slightly, perhaps less plausibly so, the Europeans, then at the rate they're being used in Ukraine, we don't have enough, and our defence industrial base doesn't produce enough. So this weapon, once again, has found itself at the centre of some very serious and very structural geopolitical debates when it comes to looking at Western defences.
This is, okay, so much to unpack there.
Huge amounts. Yeah.
There's military utility, but then there's the political utility of it as a kind of its symbolic weight, which seems to, from what you were saying, seems to outweigh the applicable battlefield utility here, at least in the calculations, because you haven't talked about that. Say these systems do arrive, and it sounds like it could take a while. Are they sufficient to solve the problem that Ukraine is facing at the moment, or because of cost, or because of, as you just said, not enough are being produced? Is it not enough to respond to the Russian ballistic missile threat?
No country is going to give away the major part of its arsenal of these weapons. So the first thing to say is someone in the West is going to have to ramp up production, because they're going to have to do it in their own interest, which they have stated. Then they should be getting on with it. And I would argue that they should be doing more than they are at the moment. So the rhetoric is ahead of the reality on that. Second part, are they necessary for defending Ukraine? Yes, but to what extent? These things cost, let's say, $2 million each. That's a very expensive way to defend against an incoming raid if the Russians are doing a 300.
Say $2 million?
Yeah.
Is that per missile or per battery?
No, missile.
So it's $2 million a shot?
Yeah. So you really want to be using them only against incoming ballistic missiles, which are aimed at things that are that politically valuable. That could be your population. That could be critical national infrastructure. It all depends on politics of any. Remember during Gulf War I, Patriots were deployed to Israel as part of the aim to keep Israel out of the war by saying, we will protect you, you don't need to get involved. Purely political operation. So I will argue that Ukraine needs to continue to evolve its integrated air and missile defense system, but it cannot be using Patriot missiles, which are capable of hitting incoming ballistic missiles at above 100,000 feet. I mean, incredibly sophisticated, but this is space warfare, pretty much on the verge of space warfare. It doesn't need to be using those to shoot down the Iranian-based drones, which are coming in and cost $20,000, $30,000 a pop max, and probably really cheaper than that. So that's why I say you need a layered defence. So I think it is necessary if you look at the way the war is evolving, because you need to shield Ukraine and its critical national infrastructure, its energy net, etc., from some of the more sophisticated Russian weaponry and neutralize that threat, but you cannot be using it to neutralize every airborne threat. And therefore, from the counter-drone drones, which Ukraine probably does lead the world in developing, through more conventional air defenses against those sexy fighter planes that you were talking about before, are, the air-breathing systems that fly through the airspace, and we all know what they're doing. You're talking about things moving at 500-600 miles an hour, and save your Patriots for the really high-value incoming ballistic hypersonic threat, and that way neuter Russia's ability to influence the war through its onslaught against Ukraine, especially Kyiv.
You've talked about the S-300 and the S-400. I remember when I was working in Russia, there was this huge debate about whether Russia would ever deliver the Iranians and I think it was S-300s at that point. And every time they promised to deliver them, the Israelis made a fuss and the Russians said, okay, we won't supply them. And then the Iranians would make a fuss and say, oh, we're going to fulfill our contract. And it went on and on and on. It became very clear that the Russians were basically using this as a way to play the Israelis and play the Iranians and get the best out of both of them. And the Europeans, as you say, have something I think called the SAMP-T, which seems to be our...
Yeah, it uses the Aster missile, which
okay.
We have actually in the UK, and it's on our canister idea. They're the canisters that are on our destroyers and frigates. The Type 45 carries them, which is why the Type 45 of the Royal Navy is probably our most sophisticated asset when it comes to the air defence of the UK.
All right. Very quickly, if you were to compare those with the original, are these just inferior imitations? Are they as good? How would you feel if you had to fly against a military equipped with one of those three? Who would you rather be bombing?
Right. So I'm not getting involved in this top trumps game, but I am going to bore you with a slightly longer answer, because go back to '94 when I was doing test flying at Boscombe Down and was involved in some of the trials, which were all very very secret, at the time. So I won't go too much of the technical stuff even now. But if you were to top trumps it, and look, that's what I mentioned before. The whole business of air defence is much more sophisticated than just you've got the missile at one end of the jousting range and an aircraft at the other. Which one's going to win? If you play that game, then the S-300 and the S-400 are sophisticated systems that use the missile to track the aircraft. So a lot of our early tactics, which was, go back to the 60s, is rotating analog radars. You could get the radar to break track with the aircraft, and if the radar can't track the aircraft, then the missile can't. And the S-300, S-400 had missiles that were part of that system, so it was very difficult to break lock on both, and. So technically, we looked at them and went, these are going to be very difficult to defeat. Look what Israel has just done over, you mentioned it before, Iran, that does have these systems. Obviously, Israel, even to the external observer, not read into all the secrets of it, has got a very good idea of how the Iranian air defense system works, and through all sorts of means, which will no doubt include electronic warfare and cyber and what have you, has the ability to neutralize in pretty short order significant elements of the Iranian air defense system. So what I've just said now, though both those elements are absolutely true, is the S-300 and 400 technically sophisticated? Yes. Is it still more important how you operate it? And if you have a very sophisticated opponent whose scientific and intelligence apparatus allows it to understand your system, then some of those technical complexities can probably be used to unpick it. Right. As ever with a sophisticated weapon, actually the very sophistication provides you with ways of unstitching it.
Okay, and those vulnerabilities, presumably, that would apply to a Patriot system or any country using the Aster as well.
Yeah, they are sophisticated systems. So you have to hope and believe that within our own military nets and with the breadth of what we do with GCHQ and other people, that we understand how the cyber electronic, or sometimes CEMA, cyber and electromagnetic effects, that we have a better understanding of that environment than our opposition. Now, to go back one, I mean, you said, should you be scared when you're flying against them? all of these systems relied on that aura to a certain extent. I mean, I remember the debates around 13, 14. Should we, if you remember the vote of August 13, do we punish Assad for using chemical weapons? And a lot of the debate then was about Syrian/Russian integrated air defense system. It's the fourth best in the world, fourth most dense, but it'll be very difficult to go against it. Well, no one had tried, and no one told the Israelis it would be very difficult to go against it. And some of us were looking at that and going, well, the Israelis seem to manage to do all sorts of things when they want to. And attacking the nuclear reactor in 2007 in Syria. So it was never as simple as a straightforward military calculation of technical competence. But there was the aura there because they hadn't been tested. As many commentators have now written, all those that bought these weapon systems off the Russians must be looking at what's happened to Iran and thinking, did we buy the dud? They probably haven't, but they probably need to make sure that the network they build in which these weapons will be used is resilient, has redundancy paths, is effective, is not going to fall foul of your sophisticated opponent having worked out how to unstitch your cleverly constructed net. So, as ever with all weapons, even the greatest weapons, there will be a countermeasure to them somewhere, and all warfare is a battle of adaptation. Whose measures and whose countermeasures are in a cycle that is inside your opposition.
What is it like flying against air defences? You've done it, right? I mean, you were flying in the first Gulf War. You were enforcing no-fly zones and things like that before. How does it feel? I mean, it must be fairly terrifying.
When you go into it, as I did in 91, all you've had is your training, and we would fly around electronic warfare ranges that would be a bit top trumpsy, as I just mentioned. You'd arrive at Spade Adam range in roughly the Borders region, Northumberland, and Hexham Valley, and you would go against particular simulated Soviet-era SAM threats, and you would learn how they sat around, talked about analogs, bleeps and squeaks. You would learn to actually hear them in your headset, and your radar warning receivers would tell you, and you would do certain maneuvers to break lock and evade them. You find in wartime, when you go and do that, your radar warning receiver is lit up like a Christmas tree all the time, because the electronic warfare environment is so dense that if you'd done what you did in peacetime training, you'd probably spend 20 minutes turning up your own fundament before you ran out of fuel and went home. So very quickly you have to work out, well, so what really is a threat and what is just background noise here? And then you realise that for the person on the ground, trying to shoot you is not like the person sat on the ground manning the simulator in the Hexham Valley in the north of England, which is air conditioned and there's no threat to them. They are deeply worried that as soon as they put their radar on, it will be found. And any number of largely American suppressive systems, suppression of enemy air defences, so carrying missiles that home on high-speed missiles that home on you, as soon as you make yourself visible, then someone's going to be attacking you, and so you feel quite vulnerable on the ground as well. And when you realise that, you also then realise that what they're looking for is the soft target, the person being stupid, the person who's not even trying to evade or do anything. And so you start then listening out for the high frequency telltale signs of the actual tracking radar or the missile guidance radar, which shows that you've been found and you have been locked onto. And that's the one where you really start to worry, and that's the one where you deploy your countermeasures to the maximum. So you very quickly evolve, as only 20-odd-year-olds can. You very quickly evolve to understand that environment. And a final point on this, because I think it's quite important, given some of the geopolitics you mentioned before, Trump, NATO, whatever. Actually, you quickly realise that, as happened in Gulf War I, the American Air Force effort in all of those quite niche, quite geeky aeroplanes, which are fighting the electronic warfare battle, you've actually got some very big guns on your side that are setting the conditions by which you can be successful, and the people on the ground should be really worried indeed. But you have to be able to create that dominance. Now, NATO could because it had the Americans investing a lot of money in all those sophisticated electronic warfare, passive and aggressive electronic warfare systems. Very few NATO nations actually own those. So another part of the geopolitics of all of this as well is that if NATO ever really wanted to deploy its air power in all seriousness, it has always, never voiced this too loudly, but it's always de facto been reliant on the capacities of the US Air Force to do that deep background stuff involving onesies and twosies of quite expensive, often very large aircraft, and ground capacities and reconnaissance capacities and other bits of cyber and electronic warfare capacities that allow you to set the conditions for everyone else, like me, flying the little aeroplanes, to operate without being shot down. So as we look forward in the current climate with the Americans, and it's not just President Trump, they've been saying this for a long time, saying European NATO nations have got to really do a heck of a lot more to look after your own backyard because we've really got our hands full in the Asia-Pacific region, then somehow Europe is going to find a way of having to invest in these onesies and twosies, which at the moment, no individual European nation does. So big questions: how do they come together? Do they pool funding? Do they buy a small fleet of these aircraft?
Which
and
aircraft
share them around NATO?
These special little aircraft you're talking about. Give us a couple of examples for the war nerds amongst us.
Well, they've all got various code names. So if I just describe the sort, the sort of things you have. First of all, you have electronic intelligence, which we do have three in this country. We used to be the Nimrod. We didn't even admit we had these back in the Cold War day. 51 Squadron was a very secretive squadron. We now have three of the thing called Air Seeker, which is that's our name for the program. Rivet Joint. The Americans have 17. There's a global fleet of 20. Those fly all the time. Those are, let's just call it electronic intelligence. They are mapping this huge sort of electronic warfare airspace element. I would say,
right. And these what? They look like big airliners, and they're just.
So that's based actually on the old 707. This is 1950. The airframe is 50s, 60s technology. I mean, it's still
good lord.
The Boeing 707. Technology. You then get some medium-sized electronic warfare aircraft. The US Navy had particularly good things, Prowler, 4 crew, based on one of their long-range bombers, beefed up to produce huge amounts of electricity, carrying jamming pods, and they would fly closer to the threat. So this is now more of a warplane, and it would identify the local enemy order of battle, where the radars are, where the SAMs are, and it would use electronic means mostly to win the electronic warfare battle. So neutralize radars, jam them, various bits and pieces there. You then go one down, you have even more agile, based on fighters, but also extremely specially modified to carry a whole range of sophisticated and now electronic attack systems. These are the wild weasels, one of the most dangerous jobs going.
Wild weasels.
That's just what the Americans would their nickname given to them. It started off with the F-4 Phantom, the F-18 two-seat version. Now there's an electronic warfare version of that, and they're also on the F-16. And these carry, once again, electronic warfare pods, very sophisticated tracking systems, so they can very accurately work out where threats are on the ground, and the anti-radiation missiles to launch a missile back down the beam that hits the radar that is in your S-300 or S-400 or any other.
This is what you were saying when you were saying, well, I know that I've got these Americans backing me up when I'm flying over Iraq or something, and that's why the person on the ground is going to be so nervous.
Yeah, so to put it into a ground environment, you might say I'd be a bit scared walking across no man's land. I'd be less scared walking across no man's land if I know behind me are a whole load of watchtowers, and above that a whole load of aeroplanes looking out for whoever might be, on the ground, and I've got a whole load of snipers behind me who'll hit anyone before they can have a chance to look at me, and I've got a whole load of people who are. Yeah, you get the picture.
I get the picture.
I'm not going to extend the metaphor, any longer. But my point being, it's not one-sided, and a lot of Euro, air forces that couldn't afford, maybe didn't understand all of that, that's going on in the background, most provided by the US, ended up with, when I started flying, true for the Royal Air Force, we had low-level tactics because the only way we could see that you could get through to targets when I first started, Cold War pilot, 1988. Our pre-planned targets were Russian airfields that might be in East Germany or a little bit further back than that. And the only way we believed you could get through to them was to fly under the radar Hence, those years where anybody who was a walker in this country, you're in the Lake District or whatever, how many Royal Air Force aircraft a day would you see?
I mean, dozens.
Dozens.
We're walking up in Wales and Snowdonia, and they'd be going around. I mean, I remember when I was a little kid climbing up a big hill in the Orkney Islands or something and feeling extremely exposed, because there I was kind of clinging onto the heather, and a couple of fast jets just came around kind of exactly at my height, probably about 200 meters off the ground. Felt very vulnerable.
Well, we took it more seriously, and we were genuinely better at it than most. I actually think that the requirement to do that has necessarily gone away, as the Ukrainians, have found. But in the wars that we've fought since, they have been technically one-sided enough in the air environment that with that great American-provided machine, you can actually go up to medium level, which is where we ended up flying in the Gulf War in 91, having trained for this low-level flying. Because in that environment, the Iraqi system that was definitely going to shoot you down eventually, just on the laws of probability, I think we work out one airfield had something like 2,000 anti-aircraft pieces on it, or something like that. It's such a ridiculous number that I think I'm right in pushing. If you just throw enough lead in the sky, as many a tornado pilot will tell you who did some of those low-level attacks, and they're coming out of the gloom in the early morning or at night, the tracer just this, you didn't believe you could fly through it. There's just this web in front of you of relatively low caliber AAA machine gun fire. Small machine guns, big machine guns, just throwing lead into the sky for you to fly through. And eventually, that will take aircraft down. That only works up to, let's say, 10,000 feet max. And so above that, you're into that electronic warfare game, you're into missiles, and the Iraqis didn't have the S-300, the S-400. It had the stuff from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And against those, what I spoke about, this sort of electronic warfare barrage, followed by the suppression of enemy air defences barrage, and then your own ability to avoid anything that might just take a pot at you, meant fly above the guns, fly at medium level. And that's how most of our operations has been conducted since. And that is what, as I understand it, that's most of what the Israelis will have been doing recently, and that's against the S-300 and S-400. So the aura has probably gone a bit.
Everything you've just said is very interesting. We had Tom Sharp, the former Royal Navy commander, in here last week, who spoke about all this in the maritime domain. But it all sounds very familiar. I mean, he said, you can't. It's difficult to describe how thin we've become in the maritime domain without the Americans. It sounds like you're describing a similar thing in the air. Is there, very quickly, is there an answer to that? If we assume that the Americans are turning to the Pacific, they're less interested in Europe and so on, I know you have views on this, play your fantasy football kind of, what would you do to the RAF or other European air forces in response to that? What's the answer?
If I look at the countries I think have done better, and let's look at why they've done better, because that helps us, and it also actually provides us, but also makes us think again in certain areas. I've already mentioned here what Israel's done against Syria. There is no way at the moment you could ask the Chief of the Air Staff and say, can you go and operate out of Cyprus, which is about the same range from Iran, and I'd just like you to, we're fed up with the Iranians, and I'd like you to take down the Iranian air defense system in toto in the next 36 hours. The Royal Air Force couldn't do it.
They couldn't do it, or they don't believe they could do it? Or they literally couldn't do it?
I would say both. So we've come to believe that we couldn't do it. I remember the debates in 13, 14 about, we discussed earlier, the Syrian air defense system. I think more for political than military reasons at the time, because the Americans didn't want to do it. They said, it's just going to be very difficult and it's a major act of war, which it would have been. But I think they could have technically done it and militarily done it in the same way that we've seen Israel do with Iran. But nevertheless, for political reasons, the administration didn't want to get involved in Syria. We then had to vote. You look at the defence spend of both those countries, and you have to ask why. And the reason is, we've already spoken about it. We've got used to providing, a few of the major muscles for a NATO operation, but not the entirety of it. So one of the strengths of NATO is the obvious ones. We don't need NATO 101, big alliance, 32 nations, blah blah blah. But what it can allow people to do is free ride slightly. Well, that's all big and expensive, and frankly, we just have one or two of those. It won't make much of a difference, so we won't bother. which removes your ability to operate on your own. And you look at, so is that necessarily the case in Europe? Well, no, it doesn't have to be the case, because you look at those countries that till recently were neutral. The Finns had war plans for defeating a Russian invasion on 7 billion a year. And when you can focus on one particular mission and focus ruthlessly on it and maintain your efficiency, then you can generate a military capacity to do it. And when you look at how poorly the Russians performed in Ukraine in the original special military operation in 22, I'm absolutely convinced that the Finns would have been very effective in repelling something similar if Russia had launched it against them. Now, they've done that on, as I say, a routine defence budget of £7 billion a year, and we're spending, depending how you calculate it, high end of 50, low end of £60 billion. The trouble is we haven't, or thought we haven't, been able to concentrate on a single mission like the Finns, because we have these global responsibilities. And so we spread bet in so many places that we don't actually cover any one base particularly well. And I won't say hide behind, that's wrong. We can justify that by saying, oh, but we'd be in an alliance.
So you're saying focus on the mission.
If you more of a mission focus, which current administration has said we should be NATO first. I would argue, and have done in print in other places, that we could have a sense of mission if we were to think much more closely about the Joint Expeditionary Force, those, including us, 10 North European, Baltic, Scandinavian nations, and help NATO by sort of organising regionally the military capacities of those countries, which are increasingly operating the same sort of aircraft. I haven't got the calculation here, but if you add up the F-35s, operated by us, the Norwegians, etc., etc., I think that's the way the Finns are going. Then you've actually got quite a potent force, and indeed 4 of the Scandinavian countries have blobbed that up to make a Scandinavian Air Force, which now looks quite impressive. Given, as I've just said, the electronic warfare capacities and the other bits and pieces that the Finns pulled together to defeat Russia. And bizarrely, the latest arrival on the scene, Finland, will probably contribute disproportionately, a lot more into NATO, because it's come as an all-up round. It's come ready as a war-fighting military with plans, integrated plans, top to bottom, and a resilient societal and defence industrial base. And so it probably does have some of those capacities. Ditto, the Swedes have developed their own versions of, talked about the boring big aeroplanes. Saab has actually got a very extensive, catalogue of good airborne radar and other electronic warfare systems. So what you could do is use the Joint Expeditionary Force as a vehicle, a sort of NATO in microcosm, which isn't a counter to NATO at all, because it's still within NATO, especially now Sweden and Finland are on board. And you could now start to coordinate that. Now, it would be possible, I think, with some of those countries to maybe share some production facilities and agree to standardise. And now you could start to generate the sort of scale that would make you regionally effective. And then from that, you could now start to look at, as NATO has tried to do in, I can think of 1 or 2 areas, has tried to build a NATO force under a NATO badge. Airborne early warning and control, the aircraft with a frisbee on the top. Well, NATO nations pool funding because most of the small nations couldn't afford one, let alone a fleet of 8, whatever it is. And so NATO runs that. Tried to do the same with ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft. So there's a precedent here. And what you've actually got now is the strategic shock of, both Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also the Americans saying we're serious this time. You've got to stump up and spend more. Probably you need to get onto your next question, but spend more has a big requirement of spend better.
Spend more, spend better. It's a theme we come back to again and again.
I'm sure Tom mentioned it as well when you discussed it with him. I mean, let me throw a stat out. You can split up, forget who came up with the categorization system, but you can split up major weapon systems, aircraft carriers, destroyers, main battle tanks, fighter jets, right? 10 of those. Across Europe, we produce 179 different types of system that are split between those 10. The Americans produce 34. So the economies of scale are always working for the Americans, because, of course, to design a fighter costs you X billion dollars. Well, for the Europeans to design a fighter costs X billion euros. But then you buy tens and the Americans produce hundreds or thousands. So you split those development costs across the unit price. And that's why, Europe can say we've actually spent more money on producing military stuff and handing it to Ukraine. Technically true. But when the Americans hand stuff over, they hand them over in the several hundreds. And with the supply chain and all the parts and all the other bits behind it, it's much more of a war-going operation. Europe has got to work out how to do that for itself. So to bring it back to missiles and other bits, yes, there is a European Patriot. The Aster missile, which we carry on as a Type 45, or SAMP-T, which is the ground-based version. If the Italians and the French have said, well, thank you very much, Mr. President Trump, but we won't be buying more Patriots and giving to Ukraine, what it has to do is say, we're really serious about ramping up production of the SAMP-T to the same level, and also learning the lessons of Ukraine and technically iterating it as the Americans have done with their battle-hardening experience of Patriot. So there's two things that Europe needs to do quickly, but Europe could step up and do that. And if it does do that, then it's producing missiles at the right rate that it will need to be credible in its own defence as well. So there's a test here of political will. How much can they burden share? How much are you prepared to pull national interests or take a hit on national interests for the greater collective good? And then we're back into game theory, aren't we? So, and then we're into the politics of European defence.
I wanted to talk about your profession, really, the flying aircraft around. And this question, I'm not really so interested here about the future of unmanned aerial systems or drones. We talk a lot about that, as opposed to kind of your feelings about it. And the question is, has the last fighter pilot been born? And if so, does that make you sad?
Well, the answer is I don't know, but the answer is I'll be pursuing that question with real vigour. And I sense this is another area where the rhetoric is pushing ahead of the reality at the moment. And there is a resistance in air forces to address that question, because I think a lot of people would be quite sad about it. But the history of warfare is it adapts, and if you don't adapt, you die. So if we go back 200 years, if your career as a naval officer had been largely based on your ability to handle a man of war in a ship of sail, and a lot of Quiberon Bay, a lot of the Royal Navy's successes was just incredible seamanship, then to lose all that because someone's invented the steam turbine, and now, rather than elegant sails, you've got tons of coke on board and nasty black smoke. That seems existential then. But navies get over it. The submarine, ungentlemanly warfare, we're not having any of those until they're incredibly useful. But once again, navies adapt. So the submarine didn't make the ship redundant, did it? But it generated anti-submarine warfare, which involved ships, aeroplanes, and satellites. So you can still trace naval warfare. If Tom Sharp was here, he could probably explain to you how the essence of naval warfare you can trace all the way back through hundreds of years. And yet it has absorbed all of those technological advances we've just spoken about. Well, I could have said nuclear reactors, couldn't I? Yeah, nuclear propulsion. So air forces are going to have to get over the sense that all flying machines have to have pilot in them somewhere doing it, because they won't all have, but some might still need it. And we need to work out what the correct balance is. So I would throw a question back at you. Given what SpaceX has managed to do, given Musk is a controversial figure apparently, but just as with SpaceX and the numbers of people it employs and the learning curve of that organization compared to, say, NASA, which now has to accept it can't compete with that. If he turned his mind to DefenseX and put that sort of brain power and computational power and engineering power onto, I want to see where an unmanned fighter goes, do we think he wouldn't do it? Do you think he wouldn't achieve it? A lot of it hinges, as we talked about before, on the electronic warfare aspects, because without the last element of control of an aircraft is if there's someone in there working the stick and rudder. But then the stick and the rudder are connected to the rest of the aircraft now via electronic means, not via wires and cables and hydraulic lines. So even then, that aircraft is vulnerable, even with the even with the pilot on board. So things are going to change. Things are going to change quickly, but they have in the past. You have to look at the past to realise, plus ça change. And you need to investigate the possibilities of the future, with extreme vigour. Sadly, most institutions, the majority of people are more comfortable with the past than they are with the possibilities of the future. And so ultimately this comes down to, a question of leadership. And I'll just say, because we're talking about European stuff, when I leave here, I'm going to see a demo by an Anglo-German company that has just flown to, wait for it, Swedish fighters, Gripens, down somewhere east of here. And those aircraft were flown for the purposes of demonstration by AI pilots. These have been flying in America before.
With nobody in the cockpit?
Well, I assume on this, actually, these days, you get airborne in an aircraft designed. Gripen is designed to have a pilot. So I will find out in a minute exactly what they did. But if you look at, if you go back just over a year, the Secretary of the Air Force in America, I think it's Frank Kendall, I think that's his name, very publicly went flying at Edwards Air Force Base, a big test pilot center in California, where we've always had a footprint. And he went flying in an F-16 with a test pilot, and they didn't touch the controls. So the aircraft got airborne, executed all sorts of basic fighter maneuvers and fighter mission profile, came back and landed itself. Now, immediately people say, oh yeah, but electronic warfare, what if you zapped it? What if you did this? What if you... Okay, fine. But right now, I need data links. I need the radio to work. I need to have electronic contact with the missile when it leaves the aircraft. All these things I need for the system to work. So that is not a totally valid killer counter argument.
No, the idea is that, well, what if you can't fly anything so sophisticated, so the only answer is to get a Spitfire out of the Imperial War Museum.
And we do have a few, yeah. But let me choose another idea here, because I think this is a version of your top trumps question earlier on, right? So let's agree with them. Let's say the losses of your unmanned fighter are twice as much as your manned fighter for the reasons you have cited. That we lose control of it because of electronic jamming, that the whatever system we have, and the aircraft goes rogue and can't be controlled, and it gets shot out of the sky. And that's happening at twice the rate of the manned fighter. Well, that would appear to be a pretty good killer excuse, wouldn't it? Okay, but what if I can afford to buy 20 of those for every manned fighter? And what if I accept those losses are twice as much, but at the end of the first 3 days of the war, remember how long it took Israel to achieve them? I've still got 300 of my unmanned fighters left, and I've shot all your manned stuff out of the sky. And I've done this across a coalition, so we've got economies of scale. At that point, the argument's a bit redundant. So what you have to do is war game this across a valid scenario, and you've got to war game it with scale, because the unmanned aircraft doesn't have to keep the pilot alive. It doesn't have to have therefore the compromises of a cockpit, or having to fly at less than 9G because that's all a pilot can stand, and triple redundant everything because the aircraft's got to be safe to keep people alive. You just make it really quite a simple flying machine, and you accept if it's gone, it's gone. So I suppose here, the phrase I coined when writing about this when I was in was the economics of lethality. The economics of lethality. And remember I spoke about, you've got this wave of US air power, electronic warfare power, cyber power behind you. Well, if you've got waves of these unmanned capacities, and you've got one or two really brilliant but manned aircraft, but that's all you can afford countering them, who are you going to bet on? And so that's where you're back into politics of funding, how much you're prepared to spend on defence, this, that, and the other. Right now, I look at the Israeli Defence Force, I look at what they did recently. They have obviously a range of manned and unmanned systems, and that's where the balance is. So the question really is, how much is that balance changing? How fast? But I think it's very hard to argue that we're not moving to a system where there'll be ever more unmanned platforms in there. I say it's just what the balance is and when we get there.
I asked Tom Sharp about whether he ever felt like he was Jack Aubrey, or Hornblower or something. I'm really interested in kind of, I suppose, the self-image, right? I suppose the one we'd pluck from the movies would be Tom Cruise. It might be a little bit too American. I don't know. When you join, you was Jaguars you were flying, I think.
Yeah, most of my flying career, yeah.
I mean, you speak like quite dispassionately about the kind of the nostalgia or the emotional aspect or the self-image of this, but do you sometimes think, well, maybe there won't be any more, any more people to follow in the footsteps of the few, so on and so forth? I mean, just tell us a bit about what it feels like.
Well, it is a good question, but it's already changed. It's already changed. So, when I joined, we had ridiculous medicals. Your eyesight, your this, that, the other, all sorts of things. And I understand that, because you need a good eyesight to see the threat. You need this, you need the other. Just the sheer physicality of flying these things. And also, if you couldn't fly them accurately and well, while 99% of your brain is doing the warfighting stuff, not worrying about just driving the vehicle, then the vehicle will kill you. And Jaguar was famous for, if you mishandled it, it wouldn't recover. And you're either, if you can eject in time, you're out, or you hit the ground. But Typhoons and F-35s, as I said, the controllers there are not linked to the flying surfaces. They're linked to the computer on the aircraft. And the aircraft, flies itself, does its best to meet your demands. So you are not operating, you don't need the same skills now to operate the aircraft as you used to. And that opens up all sorts of, other opportunities, because you're not having to recruit, the leadership of the service through this quite narrow, Venturi at the opening. So we've already taken one big step. The next step is just, rather than have the pilot in the cockpit doing that, they're on the ground doing that. And then, as I say, that allows you to make that air vehicle a lot more effective and a lot more efficient. Because at the moment, the pilot isn't flying it in the way that I understood flying when I started. So I think we have to accept that we're already there. And nostalgia and complacency are bad things. I think we were speaking before, you mentioned the naval bit, a book I recommend to everybody, Rules of the Game by Andrew Gordon, who pointed out that the second or third chapter is called The Long Calm Lee of Trafalgar. And the Royal Navy was so successful, and Trafalgar was such a crushing victory, that for 100 years no one would take on the Royal Navy. And its ability to therefore maintain itself as lean and focused and modernise just drifted away. And in that, because there's no urgency to modernise and nostalgia, organisations can ossify. So I think we have to be really wary of nostalgia and complacency, because Western air forces have been very successful since 1945, allowing us to create rather meretricious excuses for sticking with the old. At the moment, there are very smart people saying there's a new future just over a very near horizon. And if we don't steel ourselves to explore that, and someone else does, then 70, 80 years of dominance in the air environment can be lost in a matter of weeks. And just look at the investments the Chinese especially are making in all of these technologies that we've spoken about. So some people have done it. You could write the book, couldn't you, on the coming war in the Far East. And, sadly, it would paint a possible picture. So, yeah, don't become hostage to nostalgia.
Favourite film about pilots and air warfare and that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, because it gets a name check in the Battle of Britain film, my old squadron I commanded 54. I quite like that. But and also it was very well filmed, and that is indulging in the nostalgia. But there hasn't really been one recently that summed it up in the same way, if you like, that the Hurt Locker or other things showed the reality of what combat is really like on the ground. So if anybody's listening, anybody out there in film producer land is looking for an idea, then yeah, how about the genuine realities of modern air combat?
Ed Stringer, thank you very much for joining us on Battlelines.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
That's all for today. I'll be back on Monday with our next edition. Until then, that was Battlelines. Goodbye.